Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's a Ukraine War news update for the 8th of October 2023. Sorry it's a bit late today. I had sporting events to attend to with my family, kid playing rugby and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to go to where we normally start for the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. Thank you so much to Davin who has done these caveats that you can find in the description to this video below. Right, it's a relatively short news update, this one, because actually a lot of the bandwidth has been strangled by what's going on in Israel for obvious reasons. There's also been an earthquake in Afghanistan with 2,000 dying there. I mean, it's all going a bit crazy at the moment. I'm going to be spending some time looking at the Israel conflict in my next video because it has geopolitical ramifications for Ukraine, but I'll save that for then. Let's go to these general staff figures. 580 personnel lost yesterday, 21 tanks and 21 armored personnel vehicles. These are high figures. I think 580 is fairly high considering what the range has been over the last few months. Slightly fewer people lost than yesterday and the day before, but still up there at the upper end of that range that we've seen. 21 tanks and 21 APVs is a really large number. Again, the Russians must be really hurting. Even if you take 20% or more off these figures, they are still significant numbers of vehicles lost, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. 17 artillery systems, artillery pieces, is less than we've seen, but I still think that's a difficult number for the Russians. I wonder whether this is a lower number of artillery pieces due to the fact that there just are fewer artillery pieces around because they've been so heavily degraded, or whether it's just a quieter day in taking those things out, or whatever. 17 is still bad, but we have seen it in the 40s, remember, over the last week or so. So, you know, that's the context of those numbers. These tell us a story, as I always say, and I think there's just heavy fighting in certain places. And I also think drones are being used extensively by the Ukrainians, and for good reason. They are really effective, they're relatively cheap, and they are taking out huge numbers of pieces of kit. I think this is that kind of period of degradation we are going to see for the next few months at least, where the Ukrainians sit back a little bit and just let this kind of stuff do the work. 1 anti-aircraft warfare system. 5 drones, a very quiet night in terms of drones and strikes. 38 vehicles and fuel tanks. You can see a really heavy toll for the Russians in that category, and 3 pieces of special equipment. Really heavy losses for the Russians again. Now let's look at Andrew Perpetua's list. Yesterday we had a massive ratio difference massive difference in the numbers between the Russians and the Ukrainian numbers. You can see the Ukrainians have lost more in the last 24 hours, or at least there's more footage to come out for Ukrainian losses than Russians by a little bit. Yesterday the ratio was just massively in favor of the Ukrainians. So this might be a bit of a corrective, but actually when you start looking at the vehicles lost here, the Russians have done a lot worse. So if you look at the vehicles lost for the Ukrainians, it's almost, well, not almost entirely, but it's a massive proportion of civilian vehicles and unknown vehicles, who knows. But you've got SUVs, vans, pickup trucks taking up a large number of these, and then M113, Humvee, BMP2, so not high value stuff, M109 howitzer, and self-propelled howitzer, and a T-64 BV tank. So not really high value stuff there. But when you look at the Russian things that have been lost, you've got a Strela 10, that's a short range air defense system. You've got a Bren 1 recovery vehicle, a TOS 1A multiple launch rocket system, and then you've got a T90 tank, you've got T80, T72s, lots of them. So a load of tanks, and then a few other bits and pieces towards the end. This is much higher value losses of the Russians to Ukrainians. So even though the Ukrainians have lost a couple more pieces, when you look at the makeup of those pieces, you'd much rather be Ukrainians taking those losses than Russians taking the losses they have there. So I think that's worth noting. Then to go along with this idea that the Ukrainians really have degraded the Russians a lot in terms of tanks and APVs, you have Yevlash, this appears to be 12-year-old boy that, no, I'm joking. The young spokesman for the for the Ukrainians here, saying defenders of the anti-tank company of the 66th Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine destroyed. This is just one unit, destroyed 25 enemy tanks in just 4 days. We have seen really high losses for the Russians in these categories over the last 4 days, and this seems to be, or at least this is claimed by Yevlash, but then there's so much footage coming out. There's some T90s that we've seen. Here's an image of a T90. I think it was hit by an ATGM in that bit of footage. There's lots of footage coming out. Here we have another T90 taken out there, the remains of a T90M. Here we have the 47th Brigade reporting destruction of 4 Russian tanks in 1 day near Novoprokopivka. That is with kamikaze, K drones, loitering munition, doing the damage there. Just significant numbers of heavy kit being taken out by the Ukrainians, and I don't think you're seeing that going the other way. So the types of equipment we've seen the Ukrainians lose over the last few weeks, over the last month, has been heavily tilted towards less valuable stuff, as I've already mentioned. Now, Andrew Perpetua here, who's been pretty much despairing over the tactics that the Russians have been using in terms of indiscriminately hitting civilian targets with missiles over the last week, says the Russians flew a drone into a police parking lot and blew up random civilian cars for no reason. Then they tried to paint it as some kind of victory. The Russians not really showing themselves in the best light in terms of what they're doing with their military strikes. This is in Nikopol on the northern side of the reservoir by Zaporizhia. Then we have the claim that in occupied Novokakhovka, the car of the secretary of the local branch of United Russia, so that's a political party that Putin is the head of and is operating in the annexed occupied regions, well, he is reportedly blown up, according to a deputy from the party. The secretary is hospitalized in serious condition. Now he's reportedly died from his wounds. So that is I don't know whether that is a partisan activity, like saboteurs doing that, or whether that's a strike from artillery or something. Who knows? Russian deploying all available reserves north of Bakhmut. I found this interesting because north of Bakhmut is not where I would have seen them be deployed. So, quote, the enemy continues to deploy counter-assault units in this direction to prevent us from advancing in our offensive, says Yevlash again. Right, let's have a little look into this. So, quote, right now intense combat operations are ongoing, said Yevlash. The enemy continues to deploy counter-assault units in this direction to prevent us from advancing in our offensive. They are employing all available forces and reserves because they understand that losing this flank could have quite diverse consequences for them. There were some claims in... I was going to look at Russia, but we'll go back to look at... Israel, sorry. We go back to look at Bakhmut here. There were some claims that the Ukrainians had some success in this area from Rozdilivka down towards Soledar, towards Krasnopolivka there. I don't know whether that is what Yevlash is talking about in this piece here, but it could be that the Ukrainians are making some gains and Russians are pushing back in that area rather than to the south of Bakhmut. Yevlash further emphasized that the Ukrainian armed forces are attempting to thwart any Russian advance by inflicting maximum damage on Russian troops around Bakhmut. In recent weeks, the Ukraine's military has continued to advance around the frontline city of Bakhmut, inflicting losses on Russian forces and deterring attacks. On the 19th, the ISW reported evidence of severe degradation, that's 19th of September, so it's quite some time ago, of Russian forces in the Bakhmut sector, pointing to Moscow's need to deploy reserves. And I have said very often that I get the impression that the Russians are really struggling in terms of reserves. They're pulling reserves, or they have pulled reserves from Kherson to Zaporizhia. They pulled VDV units from Crimea and the northeast down to the south. They have sent in a newly formed 25th Combined Arms Army grouping up here and moving other troops, to both, apparently to Bakhmut. The idea is that they're piling in reserves there. And the idea is that they've arguably not got a lot left in the store cupboard here. That in terms of troops, without the mobilization we've seen, yes, they can draw from some kind of mobilized crypto mobilization troops that are coming through in dribs and drads, possibly newly formed units. Remember, but generally they're lacking in reserves, and this presents a precarious situation for the Russians. However, Patrugami, who is a Ukrainian source that's worth listening to says, recently I've tried to refrain from making negative statements about the overall situation. However, over the past 2 months, I've come across a continuous stream of statements, and I am guilty of this, that I find not only incorrect but also potentially harmful. One of the most recent trends I've observed is the assertion that the Russians lack reserves and are running out of troops. Here's a bit of a possible corrective to this, or putting the other side of the story. This information not only is inaccurate but also lacks substantiated data on the location and availability of Russian reserves. In the past, I've made a similar comment when regiments from the 76th Division started moving southward. Unfortunately, I continue to witness the deployment of additional units and reserves across various parts of the front line. While I harbour doubts about their potential for an offensive, they appear to be deployed in the areas where Ukrainian forces might breach defences. Their purpose seems to be slowing down Ukrainian troops and severely limiting their ability to exploit any breakthroughs. Ultimately, Russian forces may not need to advance at this moment, but aim to minimise Ukrainian gains from this counter-offensive. They aim to undermine both political and military support for Ukraine. So I agree with this, that the Russians are throwing in reserves so that the Ukrainians don't make gains, because that looks bad from a PR point of view, and they counter-attack in certain areas, or maybe have mini offensives up in, say, part of the northeastern sector, just so they can sell that as a success. So while you might argue that it's better for the Russians that they put troops straight into this southern area, maybe in Robotyne, which is like the flashpoint and arguably one of the most important areas of the front line. Why are they attacking up here and trying to make small gains? Well, it could be that allows them to say, hey, we've taken this town and we've taken that village, and they can sell that to their public, whilst they have enough troops down here to be able to just at least stop the Ukrainian advances. So that could be a rationale there. So the enemy, says Tatragami, so Russia, remains formidable and capable despite all their shortcomings. They still possess significant anti-tank capabilities, the ability to deploy remote minefields, employ loitering munitions, maintain artillery and counter-battery capabilities, and continue fortifying their defences. When individuals push the narrative that the Russians are on the verge of collapse and have exhausted their reserves, it fosters unrealistic expectations and diverts attention from the necessity for long-term planning and vision. It can lead to overemphasis on short-term optimism and hinder the recognition of mistakes, the need for change, or an increase in support. To an observer, it may seem that advances can continue endlessly. However, the situation underscores the fact that Ukraine does not possess an unlimited supply of ammunition, much of which was provided by South Korea through the US. Furthermore, Ukraine does not have an inexhaustible pool of personnel in the already deployed brigades along the front lines. Okay, and I broadly agree with that point. Maintaining a healthy optimism is absolutely necessary as our troops make further progress. It's true that Russian troops have suffered severe degradation, and counter-battery fire degraded their artillery capabilities. Their captured soldiers have testified about a lack of discipline and a diminishing will to fight. However, this optimism shouldn't transform into delusional hopefulness. Earlier this spring, I cautioned against setting unrealistic expectations and the belief that Russian defences would collapse within weeks or days, leading to celebrations in liberated Crimea. I emphasised that a counteroffensive alone would not win this war, and that we needed to plan for the long term. I hope that now my message will resonate more strongly. So I agree with large amounts of this. So last point is absolutely correct. You need to be planning for the long haul here. That the Russians. So I've said that I don't see it so much as the Russians will capitulate and break, that it's just grinding them down so much that they do have eventually a paper thin defense. And I think they don't have large numbers of reserves to draw on, and the reserves they do have will be low force quality as well as quantity. So I do think that the Russians aren't in a good place, but I also think that they've got enough to withhold the Ukrainian attack while they have other elements in place. And so this is why we should see, and I say should as in normatively, as in I think it is incumbent upon Ukraine to just sit back for a bit and do 3 months or however long, 2, 3, 4 months, whatever it is, of continual distance degradation using drones, HIMARS, artillery, precision guided munitions, cruise missiles, all these kind of things, to continue to degrade the Russian capability to prosecute an offensive. And then they can march forward, whilst also doing little probing attacks to keep the Russians on their feet and keep a defense in place for those drone operators to be able to do their thing. But I don't think the Russians have a great deal of reserves, although they might just have enough to cause the Ukrainians not to be able to advance in any kind of with any kind of speed. So anyway, that's the other side of the story to the they've got no reserves. Make of that what you will. I'll be interested to see what your ideas are in the comments below. I'm kind of moderate between those two positions. Yuri Ignat here, who's the Air Force spokesperson, has said Russia will attack Ukraine with a record number of Shaheeds during the autumn and winter. That Russia used more than 500 drones against Ukraine in September. During the 6 months of the last heating season, more than 1,000 Shaheeds were used against Ukraine. So 1,000 Shaheeds in 6 months, 500 just in September. So they really have, and I've said this a number of times, they've ramped up the use of Shaheeds, both from the import of these from Iran, but the indigenous construction of them in factories in Russia as well. He says, and we have already used 500 in just 1 month, as I say. So that's a real challenge for the Ukrainians. Now, this morning, the Russians shelled Konstantinivka in the Donetsk region. So that is just behind Bakhmut. You've got Konstantinivka. Where are you there? So there is Bakhmut, Konstantinivka, which is a bit of a staging place, Chasiv Yar as well, to Bakhmut, and it gets routinely hammered. Well, it was hit last night with Iskander missiles, causing lots of damage to, it looks like, private civilian infrastructure. But of course, the Ukrainians will almost always say that. Whether there was any military targeting there, I can't say. And then finally, because this is, as I say, going to be a little bit shorter, another update from yesterday's explosion near Jankoy. So Jankoy was hit yesterday. Jankoy is an incredibly important target for the Ukrainians. It is a logistical hub here. It has air bases, has all sorts of storage of military equipment and whatnot. So it routinely gets hammered. And it appears that that was the case yesterday. Now, Russian bloggers said a single HIMARS missile missed its target of a railway station near the military camp. But now one channel has broken ranks saying that Ukraine hit a secret special forces base, killing 21 people. So, quote, the enemy fired a missile from an S-200 complex. The blow was very serious and unfortunately accurate. 21 people were killed, 16 were wounded, said a source at the General Staff. An interlocutor in the Crimean government also confirmed the information about the missile hit. All the dead were elite special forces of the main directorate of the General Staff, GRU. Not far from Jankoy, there was a secret camp. Here, the fighters lived and trained, and from here, they went on missions, mainly to Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. The special forces base that the missile hit was strictly classified. It was disguised as an ordinary outbuilding. The Ukrainians should not have known about the GRU officers being located there. The military suspects that a traitor could have crept into their ranks, but a more likely version is that one of the locals turned the boys over to the enemy. Quote, they didn't fully maintain secrecy. They showed up to local residents, and one of them turned out to be a traitor. Maybe he is waiting for Ukraine. Maybe he's being paid, but the fact remains that the base was destroyed. The boys died. A special forces soldier who survived the missile strike told us. He explained the number of deaths by the fact that the military did not observe safety precautions and gathered in large groups. They had dinner together. Our interlocutor had just left, so he remained alive. He only had a slight concussion. Unfortunately, a rocket hit their cluster. So that has taken place. Good news for the Ukrainians. Obviously, the Russians are still making hits themselves, so it's not just one way. Remember that. But yeah, anyway, that's what I've got to say. My other bits and pieces are actually going to be concerning Israel and Hamas. We'll talk about that and how that affects Ukraine in the next video. Hopefully this was of some informative use to you. Please like, subscribe and share. It's really great if you share my channel to people who might be interested. Appreciate all of your wonderful support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.